This is a recording of Arthur E. Yensen's book, I Saw Heaven and It Changed My Life. This is the 6th edition, which was published in 1979. The very first edition was published in 1955. The foreword. For 23 years, I hesitated to publish this out-of-the-body episode because most of the people who heard me tell it didn't believe it. They thought I was either crazy or had some kind of a wild dream. Sometimes, if they went a little too far, I'd say, I was there and you weren't, so take it or leave it. For a while, I tried to tell my story in the churches, hoping to strengthen their belief in a hereafter. But to my amazement, most of the members didn't really believe in a hereafter. Evidently, they had joined churches for social reasons or to be sure to go to heaven, if there is a heaven, or to stay out of hell, if there is a hell. One minister said, "Oh, I believe you all right, but I'd be afraid to let you tell your story in my church for fear of adverse criticism." Jesus didn't waste much time on such people. He said, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." And that was in Matthew 8:22. Such people are still living under a rock. They say, no one ever came back from death to tell us about it, thinking their clever remark settled the question. But as a matter of fact, many people have left their bodies and come back. But, for reasons explained later, they don't remember it. However, this book is a well-remembered, first-hand, step-by-step account of just such an experience. 20 years later, or about 1955, there was almost a complete reversal in what people believed about the hereafter. My story became much better accepted. Some of my severest critics asked me to tell it again, and they listened politely. More and more people kept asking me about it, so I finally got out the notes I'd made at the time of the accident and wrote the following story as accurately as I could. Most of the conversation is verbatim. In the 3rd edition, I added an appendix of questions and answers as a way of giving out more information and answering the main questions people kept asking. In this edition, I've tried to throw a little more light on some of the most perplexing problems of our times. The author. Prologue. It was August 1932. I was a university graduate and a staunch materialist, believing only in what I could see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. However, I'd been brought up in a strict Christian home and force-fed religion till I was sick and tired of the church and everything connected with it. After majoring in geology at the University of Montana, I considered the stories about creation, Adam and Eve, and the flood pure mythology. I believed religion was mostly superstition used by the authorities to bugaboo and control the people. The tortures of the Spanish Inquisition and the long religious wars parading under the name of Christianity turned my stomach. If I'd been hunting for God, I wouldn't have looked for him in the churches. For my own peace of mind and ability to think straight, I thought the less I had to do with religion, the better. In 1925, while teaching science in high school at Okanagan, Washington, 2 sympathetic senior girls said to me in all seriousness, "We feel sorry for you. We think it's too bad that such a nice person as you will have to go to hell." I laughed and told them, as I did everyone else who worried about my soul, if there is an all-powerful God who loves me and wants me to believe in him, he'll furnish me with some kind of proof that I can accept. Well, so far he hasn't done it. At that time, my philosophy didn't require a God to explain things. I assumed the universe had always existed, and that life and evolution were the results of natural law and chance. I was fairly happy with this belief. I did many unselfish things for people, not for any future reward, but because I enjoyed doing them. To me, the ideal life consisted of every living thing respecting the rights of every other living thing. The only thing that really bothered me was the utter futility of life. After death, it wouldn't matter if I had ever lived. In 1926, I worked 2 months in a coal mine under Bellingham, Washington. Then 4 months for a gold dredging company in British Columbia. After that, all winter in the deep, hot copper mines under Butte, Montana. The following summer, with 2 partners, I leased a gold placer mine near the ghost town of Osceola, Nevada. The mine kept flooding, so we abandoned it. Next, I took up photograph retouching and then professional boxing. During the next 2 years, I hoboed 17,000 miles. So many interesting things happened that I decided to go to Chicago, study art, become a cartoonist, and draw hobo comic strips. While in art school, the stock market broke and the Great Depression settled down over the nation like a wet blanket and smothered business. But I stayed in school and nearly starved till I learned that I could live cheaply and well on a diet of grapes, milk, and raw oatmeal. When school closed, I tried to get a drawing job, but there weren't any. Then I tried to get any kind of a job, but for every job there were 1,000 men waiting. Once for 3 weeks, all I had to eat was steel-cut oats soaked in water. For a bed, I rolled up in newspapers. Few people today realize what the Great Depression was like. After 4 long years of frustration, I finally landed a part-time job of drawing a weekly hobo comic strip for country newspapers. It was exactly the kind of a job I wanted. The more papers that used my strip, the more money I'd make. I called it Adventurous Willie Wispo. While working on it, I was very happy because it gave me a feeling of power and lifted me out of this mundane world. Like a god, I could feed the good people in my strip and starve the bad ones if I chose. It was the most enjoyable job I ever had. But times were hard in Chicago. Every penny counted. Even though my strip was popular, many of the newspapers couldn't pay for it and wanted credit. Collections were so poor that to relieve my financial situation, I drew 12 strips ahead, packed a small suitcase, and hit the road. This stopped the rent and gave me a good opportunity to gather fresh material for my strip. I headed north up through Wisconsin and into Minnesota. There were 16 million unemployed. Countless thousands drifted aimlessly. On one train, I counted 150 hobos. It looked like a work train, but of course there was very little work. A few harvest jobs at $1.50 a day, but most farmers couldn't pay even that. All they could offer was board and room. However, compared to everyone else on the road, I was rich. Hidden on me was $15. The train crews ignored us. They let us ride anywhere we pleased except in the engineer's cab and inside the coaches. From Minneapolis, I went up into the beautiful lake country of northern Minnesota. One day while walking along the highway, I got an idea for an experiment. Even though I was through with religion, I still had considerable faith in the Bible as a book of wisdom. The Bible says over and over, "Fear not." Yet many Bible readers are worriers and afraid of their own shadows. If their biggest worry is resolved, they start worrying about the next smaller one, then the next smaller one, and the next smaller one, ad infinitum. Worry is like chain smoking. It's a bad habit that's hard to break. Worriers are also inconsistent. They ensure everything, then go to church and sing, "God will take care of you." One man had so little faith in God's protection that he wouldn't even drive his car across the street without insurance. All these things made me wonder if anyone had ever really tried to follow the advice of Jesus as given in Matthew 6:25. Do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on. Either this advice was wrong or hadn't been checked out. None of the church people I knew seemed to take it seriously. It might be interesting, I thought, to literally try it and see what would happen. There would be nothing to lose. Anything that happened would be good material for my comic strip. So with a don't give a damn attitude, I started following the advice of Jesus. The birds chirped cheerily as I walked down the highway, singing to myself. Car after car after car whizzed past, but instead of stopping to give me a lift, they only stepped on the gas. When one mad-looking car roared by, a lady's hat blew out the window. While the brakes screeched to a halt, I ran after the hat. The driver thanked me profusely, then said, "I'm sorry, but we have no room." Since there was room in the back seat, he evidently meant no room for a tramp. But I didn't care. With a smile, I replied, "Thanks anyway, I'm as well off here as I would be 50 miles down the road." He gave me a funny look and drove on. During the afternoon, a wealthy man passed me 4 times, then stopped and hollered, "Get in! I can't stand to pass you a 5th time." At first, our conversation was cold and stilted because he wasn't used to hauling tramps. But later he thawed out and became quite friendly. It was after dark when we reached Duluth, so he took me to his home for supper. Then by car, he showed me the town and invited me to sleep in one of his nice clean white beds. The next morning, after a good breakfast, we parted like old friends. As I started down the road, I said to myself, well, I'll be damned, the advice of Jesus is really working. About noon, as I neared the top of a high hill, a tall, dark, handsome young Canadian in a convertible coupe, having lost his momentum, stopped and asked me if I wanted a ride. "I live in Winnipeg, but I'll be glad to take you as far as you're going for company." Surprised at first, then thinking fast, I smiled and said, "Winnipeg, that's exactly where I'm going." As I got in, he mumbled, "Okay, but don't expect me to feed you after we get there." "Don't worry," I replied scornfully. "I can take care of myself." We rolled along at 50 miles an hour, pleasantly discussing philosophy, morals, and religion. He must have been an advanced soul, because at times he made me feel so small that I could have crawled under the seat. His wife had died, and the love he had for her was now being bestowed on all humanity. And since I was the only one riding with him, I was getting it all. That evening, he introduced himself as Fred Tibbs of Winnipeg, Canada, and insisted on taking me to dinner. I accepted the dinner, but when I refused his offer of a bed, he said wistfully, "With her gone, what difference do a few dollars make?" Down along the tracks, I crawled into an open boxcar already occupied by several other knights of the road. By rolling up in some old newspapers, I slept warm enough. The next morning at 8 o'clock, we met in front of his hotel, had breakfast, and hurried on. When I told him I was a geologist, he relaxed and took me on a side trip to see the world's largest iron mine at Hibbing, Minnesota. But that vast open pit was nothing compared to the scenery I was destined to see very soon. I saw heaven. By noon, we were out of the beautiful lake country and into the dusty wheat fields of the Red River Valley. Dust and smashed grasshoppers had accumulated on the windshield till it was hard to see the road. About 2 miles from the Canadian border, near the small town of Pembina, we overtook 2 well-dressed women in an old sedan. When we turned out to pass, Fred didn't see a ridge of oiled gravel about 3 feet high down the middle of the road. I saw it, but not in time to say anything. When Fred's car hit the gravel, we zigzagged all over the road. He fought the steering wheel bravely, but it was evident from the start that we were going to upset. Never having been in a rollover, I determined to take mental notes of all that happened so that I could describe it later in a story. I didn't realize it then, but my determination to remember everything exactly as it happened is what made this story possible. First, I noted that we were having a wild ride. Then a front wheel broke and things got a lot wilder. With a graceful somersault, we plunged upside down into a ditch, 8 feet deep, full of dusty sunflowers. After bouncing off the bottom, we flip-flopped, end over end 4 times. Then, turning sideways, the car rolled over twice more, stirring up great clouds of dust. 50 miles an hour right side up isn't fast, but upside down, it's terrible. While somersaulting into the ditch, I remember sitting weightlessly in the seat upside down, taking mental notes on exactly what it was like. Then crash! Words can't describe the violence. The cloth top crushed, and the weight of the car drove my poor shoulder into the sun-baked ground. Another jolt like that, I thought, and I'll be so dead it won't matter whether I remember anything or not. But the second time over wasn't quite so bad. Still, I thought another jolt like it would kill me. The third time over, I cracked 3 ribs on the steering wheel. The fourth time over was very confusing. All I remember is that I felt like a thin-shelled egg rattling around in a dinner pail, wondering how long I'd last. Then the car turned sideways. Rip! Out through the cloth top we flew. Side by side, we whizzed 60 feet through the air, landing hard and flat in the bottom of the ditch, with the car rolling after us. Fred's golf clubs, which were in the rumble seat, had been catapulted in a rainbow-like arc 50 feet beyond us. But Fred was a lucky boy. By hanging onto the steering wheel, he came through almost unhurt. However, when he got up and looked at his car, he said wistfully, "I've wrecked it at last." But with nothing to hang on to, I wasn't so fortunate. While trying to get up, I said to myself, I've lived through it, but now my trip to Winnipeg is shot. Through a great cloud of dust, we heard the approaching voices of 2 women. They were the ones we had just passed. One was saying, "I don't expect to see either one of them alive." "Neither do I," returned the other. Then, seeing Fred on his feet, they shouted, "Turn off your engine before your car catches fire." While Fred was turning off the motor, I was trying to get up. I rose to my knees but could get no farther. Then, seeing me, the women in their shiny silk dresses rushed over through the rough, dusty sunflowers and asked, "Are you hurt?" "I don't know. I'll have to wait till some feeling comes back." My body was numb all over, and I was only living in my head. One of the women was so good-looking that just looking at her raised my morale considerably. Then 2 men approached. One of them said authoritatively, "He's hurt bad. We've got to get him to a doctor right away." No, I protested weakly. "I can't afford a doctor. Just let me alone, please." First, I wanted to save my $15, and second, I wanted to observe a strange yet familiar feeling that was taking place inside of me. I felt as if I were coming loose from my body. While I believed that my body was me, I knew instinctively that if I separated from it, I'd be dead. I also knew that with my feeble voice, I couldn't explain anything so elusive to people so excited. Yet I tried. But they were so hysterical by this time that they paid absolutely no attention to anything I said. While the thought of dying didn't seem to bother me at all, I instinctively tried to hold my soul and body together with sheer willpower. But luckily I didn't succeed, for if I had, I would have missed the celestial sight only seen with spiritual eyes. Suddenly, a desperate man and a very anxious woman grabbed me around the shoulders and waist, jerked me to my feet, and started walking me up the steep bank toward a car. But the effort was too much. My soul and body started separating again and continued to separate until I felt a short, sharp pain in my heart, which felt as if something had been torn loose. Then slowly and softly I rose out through the top of my head. Gradually the earth scene faded away, and up through it loomed a bright, new, beautiful world, beautiful beyond imagination. For half a minute I could see both worlds at once, the earth fading away and the other world looming up brighter and brighter and still brighter. Finally, when the earth was all gone, I stood in a glory that could only be heaven. In the background were 2 beautiful mountains similar to Fujiyama of Japan. The tops were snow-capped, and the slopes were adorned with foliage of indescribable beauty. Since there was no pollution, haze, or other obstructions to mar one's vision, all the details were sharp and clear. The mountains appeared to be about 15 miles away, yet I could see individual flowers growing on their slopes. I estimated my vision to be about 100 times better than on Earth. To the left was a shimmering lake containing a different kind of water. Clear, golden, radiant, and alluring. It seemed to be alive. The whole landscape was carpeted with grass so vivid, clear, and green that it defies description. A diamond, an emerald, a rainbow, or anything you can think of would be crude in comparison. To the right was a grove of large, luxuriant trees, composed of the same clear material that seemed to make up everything. While I stood there marveling, I saw 20 people beyond the first trees, playing a singing, dancing game, something like Skip to My Lou. They were having a hilarious time holding hands and dancing in a circle. fast and lively. Their singing, their laughter, and even their shouting was melodious. As soon as they saw me, 4 of the players left the game and joyfully skipped over to greet me. As they approached, I estimated their ages to be 130, 220, and 112. Their bodies seemed almost weightless, and the grace and beauty of their easy movements was fascinating to watch. As they gathered around, I was impressed by their cheerful, radiant faces, their perfect figures, and their bubbling life. Both sexes had long, luxuriant hair, entwined with flowers, which hung down in glossy masses to their waists. Their only clothing was a gossamer loincloth with a loop over one shoulder and a broad ribbon streaming out behind in graceful curves and curlicues, greatly enhancing their overall beauty. To me, they were the ultimate in people, dressed in the ultimate of fashion and living in an ultimate land. Even though they didn't look alike, each one was perfect in his own way. Their magnificence not only thrilled me, but filled me with awe. However, since they all radiated love and friendship, I quickly felt welcome and very much at home. I marveled at their skins, which seemed transparent with purity, and their beautiful, shapely feet, which looked as if they had never worn shoes. Some way I had forgotten, or never knew, how beautiful an unspoiled foot can be. From my solar plexus sprang a well of life which flowed out through my arms and legs, giving me more energy that I could use. I seemed to weigh nothing. Every part of my body was a source of pleasure. Existence was ecstasy. As the heaven people gathered around, the oldest, largest, and strongest-looking man announced pleasantly, "You are in the land of the dead. We lived on earth just like you till we came here." With unbounded enthusiasm, I shouted, "This is wonderful!" "It's marvelous," they answered. Then with delight, they told me how I could swim around in the lake as long as I pleased, and when I came out, I'd be dry. Another one said, "You can run, jump, dance, sing, and play as much as you want to, and you'll never get tired." "Wonderful," I repeated. "But why is everything so clean and new?" "Look at your arm." I looked, and it was translucent. That is, I could dimly see through it. Next, they had me look at the grass and trees. They were also translucent. It was exactly the way the Bible had described heaven. And the streets of the city were pure gold, as it were transparent glass. Revelations 21:21. Then I noticed that the landscape was gradually becoming familiar. It seemed as if I had been here before. I remembered what was on the other side of the mountains. Then, with a certain burst of joy, I realized that this was my real home. Back on Earth, I had been a visitor, a misfit, and a homesick stranger. With a sigh of relief, I said to myself, "Thank God I'm back again. This time I'll stay." Then the oldest man, who looked like a Greek god, continued to explain. "Everything over here is pure. The elements don't mix or break down as they do on Earth. Everything is kept in place by an all-pervading master vibration, which prevents aging. That's why things don't get dirty or wear out, and why everything looks so bright and new." Then I understood how heaven could be eternal. Revelations 21:5. "Behold, I make all things new." Next, I noticed that I was loving everything and everybody, and that it was making me intensely happy. Apparently, only the good in me had survived. Without the bad, which is discord, I was happy beyond anything I had ever known. My next question was, how do you explain this intense happiness? Your thoughts are vibrations which are controlled by the master vibration. It neutralizes all negative thoughts and lets you think only the good thoughts, such as love, freedom, and happiness. Then what becomes of the old grouches? If they are too bad, they go to a plane of lower vibrations, where their kind of thoughts can live. If they came here, the master vibration would annihilate them. After death, people gravitate into homogeneous groups according to the rate of their soul's vibrations. If the percent of discord in a person is small, it can be eliminated by the master vibration. Then the remaining good can live on here. For example, if a person were 70% good and 30% bad, I'm not sure of these percentages, the bad could be eliminated by the master vibration and the remaining good welcomed into heaven. However, if the percentage of bad were too high, this couldn't be done. and the person would have to gravitate to a lower level and live with people of his own kind. In the hereafter, each person lives in the kind of a heaven or hell that he prepared for himself while on earth. If you threw a small pebble into a threshing machine, it would go into the grain box, not because it is good or bad, but because of its proper size and weight. It's the same way here. No one sends you anywhere. You are sorted by the high or low vibrations of your soul. Everyone goes where he fits in. High vibrations indicate love and spiritual development, while low vibrations indicate debasement and evil. When I asked what a person should do while on earth to make it better for him when he dies, he answered, all you can do is to develop along the lines of unselfish love. People don't come here because of their good deeds, or because they believe in this or that, but because they fit in and belong. Good deeds are the natural result of being good, and bad deeds are the natural result of being bad. Each carries its own reward and punishment. It's what you are that counts. Your earthly life is not supposed to be happy. We call it a miserable preliminary. If you find any joy in it, you are just that much ahead. Don't worry about what happens to you while on earth, but concentrate on how you live and develop spiritually. This is the real life, and worry is the most foolish thing you can do. Then I asked about the beautiful music which seemed to be coming from everywhere. I estimated it to be 100 times more beautiful than anything I had ever heard. The whole country resounded with it, and everything seemed to be in tune. It had a different swing than earth music, which by comparison is very coarse and crass, mostly noise. Sometimes now when I listen to the best of earth music, I notice a slight resemblance to heaven music, as if the composer were consciously or unconsciously trying to imitate it. Heavenly music is so far beyond earth music that the most I know about it now is from mental notes I made at the time. Earthly brains can't remember so fine a thing. Now I know what the Bible means when it says, no eye hath seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man conceived what God hath prepared for them that love him. 1 Corinthians 2:9. Then the large man continued, everything over here is crystalline, and since it vibrates in harmony with the master vibration, it can only give off pure tones. As one moves about, the blending of so many pure tones creates a symphony of perfect music. While we talked, my mind, or whatever I had to think with, became crystal clear. Instantly and without effort, I could remember everything I had ever known. I seemed to understand the earth and all about it. The whole scheme of life was plain as day. Everything on earth had its purpose. It all fits into a pattern which will, in the end, work out for justice and good. People worry because of their incomplete viewpoints. They don't realize that trouble is nature's way of teaching lessons that won't be learned otherwise. If we'd only learn from other people's troubles, we could avoid most of our own. While we were still talking, I was enjoying the ecstasy of heaven. My friend gently announced, you can't stay here any longer. You have to go back to Earth. Back to Earth? Oh no, not back to that horrible place. But already I was leaving this beautiful land and slipping back into my body. Still enough in heaven to have no inhibitions, and yet far enough back into my body to have terrible thoughts. Like a kid having a tantrum, I kicked and screamed, let me stay, but all my protesting did no good. As I moved farther back into my body, there was a painful, prickly feeling all over, similar to a foot waking up. Also a crowded feeling as if the real me was having to compress itself to get back into its hateful prison. The last thing the strong man said to me was, you have more important work to do on earth, and you must go back and do it. There will come a time of great confusion, and the people will need your stabilizing influence. When your work on earth is done, then you can come back here and stay. But going back to Earth was a sickening experience, mostly because I thought I was through with it forever. As soon as I began re-entering my body, the evil part of me, which had probably been left behind in my brain, began asserting itself. First, it robbed me of my exuberance and intense happiness. Then it dulled my great desire to help stabilize the world. And finally, from the noble soul of a moment ago, I became a conglomeration of good and evil like everyone else. I had found my Shangri-La, and selfishly, all I wanted to do was stay there. I would have stayed, except that someone bigger than I was running the universe. In the meantime, heaven was fading, and the first signs of earth, rough, dusty sunflowers, were looming up with shocking ugliness. Again, I could see both worlds at once, one slowly replacing the other. This was the saddest moment I have ever known. Since I couldn't stay in heaven, where I was supremely happy, I cringed at the thought of returning to earth. I even wanted to hide from the dreadful years ahead. After heaven had completely disappeared, its lovely melody lingered on. I was determined to remember one chord of it. I thought that if ordinary musical notes could be filtered through crystals, the resulting tones would startle the world. But then the music died away. I found to my surprise that I couldn't remember any of it. Then it occurred to me that I had left my brain in the ditch and was using something else to think with, and that if I wanted to remember any of what had just happened, I'd have to run it through my brain quickly. Consequently, I started at the beginning and reviewed everything as fast as I could. But before finishing, I was so far back into my body that the pain turned on and completely distracted me, making me temporarily forget everything. After every trace of heaven had disappeared and I was back in my body, I became conscious of events taking place here on earth. The man of authority, who didn't know either me or the women, was shouting triumphantly, "Don't cry, lady, your husband isn't dead. See, he's beginning to breathe." Somewhat confused, I opened my eyes. Kneeling in front of me was a beautiful woman, mopping my forehead with ice water and crying as if I belonged to her. As tears dropped in my face, I looked up at her and innocently remarked, "I didn't know I was married, but if I am, I hope it's to you." Everyone laughed and were greatly relieved, except me. I hurt all over. There were 17 holes in my shirt and a rip in one trouser leg 2 feet long. Except for the attentions of that lovely woman, I was in complete misery. Fred rode to town with the men, while the women took me in their car. Even though they were in a hurry to keep an appointment, they stopped somewhere and got me a drink of water. When they let me off at the doctor's office, they said, "We're very glad you didn't die." After looking me over, the doctor charged Fred $5. Then turning to me, he said, "Except for a very strong heart, you would have died. That collarbone, we won't touch it. It will form a new socket. You'll have to carry both arms on your chest and move them as little as possible." 2 weeks later, a chiropractor put the collarbone back into its original socket. After popping out a few times, it stayed and has been all right ever since. After a long, painful afternoon in the depot, we took a train to Winnipeg. Fred took me home with him, where his mother and sister were very kind to me. 5 days later, I was ready to travel. While the Tibbs were very fine people and made me feel perfectly at home, I didn't want to overstay my welcome, especially after telling Fred in no uncertain terms that I could take care of myself. I thanked him the best I could, said goodbye, and started walking down the highway. I thought the best thing to do while convalescing would be to visit my folks in western Nebraska. To save money and perhaps have more adventure, I began looking for a ride. Both arms were almost useless. I had to have help to get into boxcars. At night, on account of being so sore, I always tried to sleep in a straw stack. One night, there wasn't a stack in sight, so I piled Russian thistles into a ditch and slept on them. For food, I lived almost entirely on raw roasting ears, 8 a day. One day I couldn't find a cornfield, so I ate the unpollinized ears from the scattered stalks in a potato field. Over the next hill I found a wonderful field of corn, but I was full of cobs. 10 days after the accident, as I was crawling out of a haystack in the sand hills of Nebraska, I suddenly remembered everything in the exact order that I had run it through my brain. It all came back with startling vividness. At first, I was delighted. The beautiful memories were overpowering. It was too good to be true. But when I realized where I'd really been, I was flabbergasted. All kinds of questions raced through my head. Why had God shown heaven to a tramp like me instead of to someone of importance who would tell the world about it, and the world would listen because his word would carry weight? Why had all this been shown to me? I didn't know, unless maybe someday I was to write a book. After calming down, I decided to evaluate what I'd seen scientifically. Maybe I was kidding myself. The more I thought about it, the more bewildered I became. All my materialistic philosophy, which I had so thoughtfully built up over the years, fell flat. It seemed as if everything I was sure about conflicted with something else. For a long time, I sat by the haystack pondering. I was so badly mixed up that, for my own peace of mind, I had to get a few things straightened out. In geology, I had been taught that a true scientist will follow truth no matter where it leads him and accept as true whatever the facts indicate. Since I had always liked to consider myself a scientist, I started to analyze the whole experience. First, I considered dreams. But I decided it couldn't have been a dream, because in a dream there is an ebbing of one's consciousness, even to the loss of all reasoning, while my awareness and mental powers had probably been increased 10 times. It was the exact opposite of a dream. Hallucinations didn't explain things any better. They are caused by an organic derangement of the brain or nervous system, which causes one to see as real things which have no physical substance. While seeing heaven, I was standing up and was several feet away from my brain and nervous system, which were still lying in the ditch. But as soon as I rejoined them, I thought, felt, and heard the same as always. So I decided it couldn't have been a hallucination. Next, I considered visions. During a vision, one is not conscious of leaving his body. In fact, he doesn't know anything about his body because he is just an intelligence in space. I distinctly remembered leaving my physical body and knew that I had been in a spiritual body because when I looked at my arm, I could partly see through it. Therefore, it wasn't a vision. As already mentioned, while out of my body, my spiritual eyes and ears were unbelievably acute, and whatever I used to think with was beyond logic, crystal clear, and backed up with a perfect memory. In fact, it was the kind of a mind I've always wanted. The only explanation that fits all of the facts was that I had actually left my body, as in death, but because it was not my time to die, I was pulled back into my body by an unknown force. As I sat by the haystack wondering, the spiritual world seemed more real than this one. Epilogue. It was almost 3 years before I could adjust my thinking to what I'd seen. 2 other times I've contacted the same plane. Each time was as convincing as an electric shock. The first time was 15 years before the car wreck during World War I at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I was sick with scarlet fever, but the doctors thought it was only a cold and sent me back to work. Every day I grew weaker until one day I fainted. While falling, I momentarily saw that same beautiful land. It was such a thrill that I got up and purposely fell again, but no luck. Then for the next 15 years, or until this happened, I wondered what I'd seen. The other time was in 1933. About a year after the car wreck. As I was getting out of bed, just for a second, I felt the same unmistakable thrill of the other world. This time I didn't see or hear anything, but I felt it vividly, enough to dispel all doubts about the other world being very real and very near. Altogether, I've told this story a great many times. At first, very few people believed me, unless they'd had and experienced something like it. Such people were usually afraid to mention it for fear of ridicule. A neighbor woman, after reading the first edition of this book, said, "I left my body once during a sick spell 28 years ago, but I never told anybody. Not even my husband, for fear they'd laugh at me." However, ridicule didn't bother me. I'd seen heaven and my critics hadn't, so what did they know about it? For several months after the incident, I told my story with great enthusiasm. But since so few believed me, I gradually quit talking about it unless I was sure my listeners were open-minded and sincerely interested. In those days, talking to the scientifically educated about spiritual phenomena was like talking to a wall. They said I either had a dream or was some kind of a nut. Of course, I should have known better. 2,000 years ago, the Bible warned us against such arrogance. Give not that which is holy to the dogs, neither cast ye pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn against you and rend you. Matthew 7:6. By 1955, I was again teaching biology in high school. The theory of evolution was very upsetting to the kids from the fundamentalist churches. A big burly football player blurted out in class one day, "God made man and he didn't come from any monkey either." "Then why does a man act so much like a monkey?" I asked. But that was a very poor answer for a frustrated boy who sincerely believed the Adam and Eve story. I felt so sorry for those kids that one day I said, "Science doesn't know everything yet. You should hear what happened to me once." Then, even though it was against my better judgment, I told them the whole story. They sat on the front edges of their seats with their mouths open. Then, when the incoming classes heard about it, they demanded that I tell them the story. Before the day was over, I had told it to all of my classes. 170 students. That evening, they shouted the news everywhere. "Mr. Yensen's been to heaven!" Every kind of reaction came back from their parents. The next Sunday, the LDS Church invited me to tell the whole story to their Sunday evening congregation. It took 30 minutes. Then they questioned me 45 minutes. After I'd answered most of their questions satisfactorily, the bishop arose and remarked, "Nothing you have said conflicts with anything we teach. The truth is, you're a good Mormon, only you don't know it." After the next school board meeting, I received a special communication from the school board which said, "Mr. Yensen, don't tell your story anymore on school time." Later, I told this story to a skeptical Dianetics group who had me hooked to a lie detector. After I had finished, the stranger came out of the crowd and said, "I believe you all right because I was dead 3 weeks once, only I went to hell." "Tell me about it," I asked excitedly. It was a semi-dark, gloomy place with mangled, mutilated, stinking, diseased, ugly bodies lying all over the place. Everyone was so disagreeable, hateful, and quarrelsome that I don't even want to talk about it. I'm scared to death for fear I'll have to go back. Then suddenly he was gone and I never saw him again. I had no idea who he was or where he went. When I inquired about him, some of the people said they'd seen him about town but didn't know who he was. The end.